Do you have any idea how much I put up with while you're out all day? I shot back, my frustration spilling over. Mom takes care of Dad during the day, doesn't she? My husband replied, as if that solved everything. I have a job to do. If I quit, am I just supposed to become his personal servant 24 hours a day? Is that what you expect? The very thought made my skin crawl. There was no way I was giving up my independence. I had anticipated this kind of attitude from my father-in-law. He had always been overbearing, so none of his demands surprised me. But what I had not expected was my husband's response. Dad can't move much. It's not his fault, he said, shaking his head. You should at least help him as much as you can. The doctor said he should be doing things for himself. I reminded him. He needs to stay active. That doesn't matter. He thinks he can't do it. Just take care of him, will you? His voice carried that same dismissive tone, as if my exhaustion was just an excuse. I realized then that this was my life now. No matter what I said, no matter how much I reasoned with him, my husband saw me as nothing more than an extra pair of hands. Then, one day, while he was away on a business trip, an envelope arrived in the mail. Divorce papers. Perfect timing. I was done. I would sign and file them immediately. Are you sure about this? You have kids to think about. A friend asked when I told her my decision. I've never been more sure in my life, I said, knowing that staying would only mean losing myself entirely. My name is Rachel, and I am a 42-year-old mother of two. My son, Ethan, is in 7th grade, and my daughter, Lauren, is in 6th. I work part-time, about 4 hours a day, which is all I need to help support myself and my kids. I met my husband when I was 23. I had just graduated college and started my first job when a colleague introduced us. He was 26, working at a prestigious trading company, polished, well-spoken, the kind of guy who made you feel special just by looking at you. From our first conversation, I was hooked. After 2 years of dating, we got married. I kept working, but when I got pregnant, complications arose. The doctor put me on bed rest, and eventually, I had to be hospitalized. You and the baby are my top priority, my husband told me. Why don't you take a break from work? You can go back once the kids are older. I hesitated, but in the end, I agreed. I love my job, but I didn't want to put my health, or the baby's, at risk. I left my position and focused on my growing family. Our son, Ethan, arrived safely, followed a year later by our daughter, Lauren. For a while, life was good. Then everything changed. 12 years into our marriage, when Ethan was 11 and Lauren was 10, my father-in-law suffered a stroke. He survived, but his body never fully recovered. My mom can't do this alone, my husband told me one night. I think we should move in with him. I hesitated. His parents' house was only a 30-minute drive from us, so we visited often, but I never felt comfortable there, especially around his father. The man had never hidden his belief that women existed to serve men. It's good you quit work after having kids, he once told me. Women today are ridiculous, thinking they need careers. His words had stuck with me, and I knew living under his roof would be a nightmare. But my mother-in-law was a kind woman. She had always supported me, even subtly pushing back when her husband criticized me for working after marriage. She understood my need for independence, and I didn't want to leave her to handle everything alone. I agreed, convincing myself that my husband would back me up if things got too difficult. That was my first mistake. The problem started almost immediately. When are you quitting your job? My father-in-law asked within the first week of us moving in. I'm not, I said firmly. I only work part-time. I have no reason to quit. His frown deepened. I thought you had potential when you quit after having Ethan. I was wrong. It became clear that he had expected me to be at his beck and call from morning till night. But I had no intention of giving in. When we moved in, we had renovated the house to make it wheelchair accessible. My father-in-law had an electric chair he could use indoors, and we installed handrails throughout so he could move independently. Everything was designed to help him be as self-sufficient as possible, but he refused to do anything on his own. Even if he needed something right in front of him, he would call out for either me or my mother-in-law to fetch it. It would be good for you to move around a little, I told him one day. His face turned red. How dare you, as my daughter-in-law, speak to me like that? You do not give me orders. I clenched my teeth. The truth was, he could move just fine. He just did not want to. Instead, he sat there, barking commands, expecting us to cater to his every need. But I had braced myself for this. I knew he was difficult. What I had not prepared for was my husband's attitude. Do you have any idea how much I deal with while you're out all day? I snapped, my patience wearing thin. My mom is with him during the day, right? My husband, Jake, replied casually. I have to work. Besides, if I quit my job, what then? Am I supposed to cater to my dad 24 hours a day? He looked at me like I was being dramatic. Dad can't move much. It's tough for him. You should at least make things easier for him. The doctor said he needs to do what he can on his own. I reminded him, trying to keep my voice steady. That doesn't matter if he feels like he can't. Jake shot back. Just help him out. That's not too much to ask. He spoke as if I was trying to dodge responsibility, completely ignoring the fact that his father's care had been dumped entirely on me. We used to be a team, at least when it came to raising the kids. But now, my husband had washed his hands of it all. Your mom is there too, he added. The kids need their mother the most anyway. It's best if you take care of things at home. It did not matter what I brought up. He always found a way to shift the responsibility onto me. Before we moved in with his parents, life was hectic but good. We made time for each other, even on the busiest days. After the kids were asleep, we would unwind together, sharing a drink, watching a show, just enjoying each other's company. After moving into his childhood home, those moments disappeared completely. Now, my days followed the same exhausting routine. I woke up early to make breakfast, saw Jake and the kids off, then spent the morning taking care of my father-in-law. After that, I rushed to my part-time job. My mother-in-law prepared lunch, but after work, I had to handle the grocery shopping and cook dinner. Then, I alternated shifts with her to care for my father-in-law. And no matter what I did, it was never enough. My father-in-law never stopped complaining about the fact that I worked. You have no idea how much I suffer while you're off doing whatever you want, he grumbled one morning. Mom is here with you, right? I answered. I have to work. That's why I keep telling you to quit. Jake is too soft on you. That's why you've gotten so stupid. If I quit my job, I knew exactly what would happen. I would be at his beck and call every hour of the day. The thought made my stomach twist. I refused to let that happen. One evening, after my father-in-law had gone to bed, my mother-in-law quietly apologized to me. I'm sorry, she murmured, avoiding my eyes. He's always been controlling, but ever since he lost his mobility, it's gotten worse, she added. She was right. He treated us like extensions of himself, like we existed solely to serve him. He loved giving orders, making us run around while he sat back and acted like a king. You don't have to just take it, I told her. You should live the way you want. But she only gave me a tired smile, as if she had already given up. I wanted her to understand that we did not have to let him treat us this way. But no matter how many times I tried to talk to her, nothing changed. And that frustration built inside me day after day. A year after we moved in, things got worse. My father-in-law's health took a sharp decline. He was now bedridden most of the time, but his sharp tongue never lost its bite. "Why are you so slow? You're useless," he would snap. "I wouldn't have to suffer so much if you actually put effort into what you're doing." He directed most of his anger at me and my mother-in-law, constantly berating us. And when my mother-in-law tried to step in to protect me, he turned violent. "You women are worthless," he spat. "After all these years, this is what I have to live with? I must have terrible luck." He started throwing things at her, newspapers, magazines, whatever was within reach. I fought back at first. I told him off more times than I could count. But whenever I stood up to him, he only doubled down on my mother-in-law. So eventually, I stopped arguing. I just did what needed to be done in silence. I told Jake about everything. I told him how his father was treating us. But every time, he dismissed it. "I don't know what you want me to do about it," he said. "I left Dad's care to you and my mom. Just handle it, okay?" He never once stepped in. Never once took any action. "Work is crazy right now," he added. "I just need to get through this busy period. Can you take care of things until then?" I could not argue. Renovating the house had drained our savings, and we needed his income. I understood that. So I gave up on asking him for help. Then, something even worse happened. My son, Ethan, started mimicking my father-in-law. "Just hurry up and do it," he snapped at me one evening. "Why are you so slow?" At first, I thought it was just his age. Maybe he was acting out because middle school was stressful. But the way he spoke, the way he looked at me, made it clear this was not normal. It was not just me. He treated my mother-in-law the same way, and even his little sister. "Who do you think you are? Apologize," I demanded one night after he spoke cruelly to Lauren. "Shut up," he shot back. "Women shouldn't talk back to men." Then he stormed off and slammed the door so hard the walls shook. He was turning into a younger version of my father-in-law. And as much as I hated to admit it, my feelings toward him were changing. The love I had as a mother was still there, buried deep, but resentment had started to grow. I could barely stand to speak to him anymore. I told Jake what was happening, begged him to step in. "He's just at that age," he said with a shrug. "It's normal. A little rebellion is expected. I was like that too." Did he seriously believe that? Did he really think Ethan acting like his abusive grandfather was just normal teenage rebellion? "He's not hitting anyone, so it's not that bad," Jake said casually, brushing off my concerns. "He slams doors, yells, and throws things. How is that not violence?" I shot back. "So what? We should punish him now just in case he might get violent someday," he replied, rolling his eyes. "That's not what I'm saying," I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. "But we can't just sit back and let it get worse." "We should see how things play out," he said dismissively. That was it. That was all he had to say. I realized then that trying to reason with him was a waste of time. Not long after, everything changed. My father-in-law passed away. It happened suddenly, in the second year of us living together. His condition had been deteriorating for a while, but one day he had a seizure, and that was it. The funeral was rushed. Then, just like that, life went back to normal. Except I had forgotten what normal even felt like. If normal meant life before moving in with Jake's parents, before spending every waking moment taking care of his father, then this was not normal at all. Every day was still the same. Wake up, make breakfast, get the kids off to school, go to my part-time job, pick up groceries, cook dinner, do housework, and collapse into bed at night. The routine hadn't changed, but my heart was not at ease. And when I looked at my mother-in-law, I saw the same emptiness in her eyes. "What do we do now?" she asked me one evening, looking genuinely lost. It was time to make some decisions. Meanwhile, Ethan had turned into a full-blown version of his grandfather. No, he was worse. As if trying to fill the void left behind, his behavior escalated. One evening, I heard a loud thump from the living room and rushed in to find Lauren, my daughter, sprawled across the couch, eyes wide in shock. "Ethan, what the hell was that?" I yelled. He just stood there, arms crossed. She needed to learn her place. Lauren had done nothing but ask him to throw away his own snack wrappers. That was enough to set him off. "Women shouldn't talk back to men," he said with a smirk, as if he was proud of himself. I felt a surge of anger so strong I had to steady myself. I told Jake immediately. "Ethan shoved Lauren today," I said, keeping my voice firm. "It's getting worse." "You need to do something before. They were probably just playing around," he interrupted. "It wasn't playful," I said, my patience snapping. "And he's only going to get bigger and stronger. We need to stop this now." Okay, he sighed. "I'll talk to him when I have time." Then, as if the conversation was over, he casually added, "Oh, by the way, I leave for a business trip tomorrow." He left the next morning without another word. As I watched his car pull out of the driveway, I muttered under my breath, "Looks like it's time for me to take serious action." I didn't have to wait long. A few days into his trip, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. I opened it without thinking. Inside were divorce papers. My hands trembled, but not from sadness. It was almost funny. So that was it, huh? Now that his father was gone, I was no longer needed. He really was that predictable. I laughed to myself as I stared at the papers, shaking my head. Fine. If this is what he wants, I'll give it to him. As I was filling out the forms, humming to myself, my mother-in-law walked in. "You're really okay with this?" she asked hesitantly. "I mean, considering the kids." I looked up at her, still holding the pen. "I'm totally fine," I said, smiling, because Jake had no idea what was coming. I could have rushed to the courthouse that day, but that would have been too hasty. No, I needed to handle this properly. "Timing is everything," I said, setting the papers aside. My mother-in-law let out a heavy sigh. "It's sad, but he did this to himself," she murmured. She wasn't looking at me with pity. She was looking at her son, the fool who thought he could discard me like yesterday's trash. A few days later, Jake returned from his business trip. The moment he stepped through the door, the first thing out of his mouth was, "So did you sign them?" I folded my arms and looked at him. "Before that, I have a question," I said. He blinked, looking thrown off. "Why?" I asked. "Why do you want a divorce?" He hesitated, probably expecting me to cry and beg. But I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. He still did not answer, so I reworded my question. "What exactly made you decide this?" For a second, he just stared at me. I could see him scrambling to come up with an excuse. Finally, he said, "What do you think?" Coward. He was trying to manipulate the conversation, trying to make me explain his decision. "I don't know," I said flatly. "That's why I'm asking. No more answering questions with questions. Tell me straight." I watched his face shift. Suddenly, he looked nervous. "You're indifferent to me," he said finally. I raised an eyebrow. "Indifferent? You make all the decisions about the kids and everything else without including me," he said, puffing up his chest like he had finally found his argument. I almost laughed in his face. He had spent years ignoring me, pushing responsibilities onto me, acting like everything was my problem to handle. Now he wanted to blame me for that. Jake had no idea what was coming next. "You should watch how you speak to your husband," Jake snapped, his face twisting with irritation. "Is that supposed to scare me?" I shot back, completely unfazed. "I've dealt with your father and Ethan's yelling for years. Your loud voice doesn't bother me." His face turned red with anger, but I didn't let up. "Let me repeat myself," I said, keeping my tone steady. "I tried talking to you about everything. You are the one who ignored me." "That's a lie. You never said any of that," he barked. "Oh, really?" I reached into my bag, pulled out a small recorder, and placed it on the table between us. Then I hit play. Jake's voice filled the room, detached and uninterested, responding to every concern I had ever raised. The proof was all there. "Why the hell would you record something like this?" he demanded, his expression darkening. "Because I knew this day would come," I replied calmly. "I knew you'd try to pretend none of this ever happened. So I made sure to keep records. This, this is exactly what I hate about you," he sputtered, his face burning with fury. "This is why I want a divorce." With that, he grabbed the recorder and hurled it across the room. It hit the wall and shattered into pieces. Jake folded his arms, smirking. "Well, there goes your little evidence." I let out a small chuckle. "You really think that matters?" His smirk faltered. "I have backups," I said, crossing my arms. "And by the way, everything you just did, that's all on camera." Jake's eyes darted around the room. "You never paid attention to anything in this house, did you?" I continued. "We installed security cameras when your father was still alive, so we could monitor his movements for safety." "You just destroyed my property on camera, without any discussion. That's all getting recorded too. That's not fair," he snapped. "Dad's gone. You don't need those cameras anymore. That's not for you to decide," I said flatly. And lucky for me, I never got around to disabling them. Jake was practically shaking with anger, but I kept my cool. "So tell me again," I said. "Why do you really want this divorce?" "Because I won't agree to anything until I hear the truth." He hesitated. "You never respected me as a husband," he finally said. "That's your final answer?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "Before you say anything else, remember, I have plenty of evidence." Think carefully. For the first time, he looked genuinely nervous. I didn't give him a chance to recover. "You'll tell me the real reason, won't you?" I pressed. He swallowed hard, then finally muttered, "You've lost your appeal." I blinked. "Excuse me?" "You've changed," he said, avoiding my gaze. "Since we moved here, you've become too much like a housewife. I don't see you as a woman anymore." I let out a sharp laugh. "That's rich," I said. "You mean because I was taking care of your father? Because I was running this entire household while you did nothing? You could have made an effort," he muttered. "If you really wanted to, you could have kept yourself attractive." I couldn't hold back my laughter. "Try telling anyone else that excuse," I said, shaking my head. "See how well that goes over." He had dumped all responsibility for his father on me, refused to help with the house, the kids, or anything, and now he wanted to act like I was the one who had let things go. He probably knew how pathetic his excuse sounded. But now that he had said it out loud, he was stuck with it. Still, I decided to throw him a bone. "You know what?" I said, shrugging. "Fine. I want a divorce too." Jake's eyes lit up. "But," I added, "there are conditions." His face fell. "What conditions?" "First, you owe me compensation." "For what?" he demanded. "I haven't done anything to deserve that." I reached under the table, pulled out a thick folder, and slid it toward him. Jake hesitated, then opened it. Inside were multiple photos of him with another woman, his mistress. His face drained of color. "You were cheating," I said simply. "And you started before we even moved in with your parents." "How did you?" he stammered. "Easy," I said. "You hated your father. You never wanted to live with him. Then all of a sudden, you pushed for us to move in? It didn't add up." Jake's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "So, I did a little digging," I continued. "And surprise, surprise, turns out you had someone else lined up this whole time." The other woman was his subordinate at work. It hadn't even been difficult to get proof, and I had held on to it. At first, I had hoped that after seeing me take care of his father, Jake might change. That maybe he'd realize what kind of person he had become. But instead, he had gotten worse. Much worse. "So here's the deal," I said, leaning forward. "You and your mistress are going to pay up. A lot. And I will be collecting." Jake clenched his jaw, his eyes darting around as if looking for a way out. But I wasn't finished. "Also," I added, "I don't need child support." His head snapped up. "Really?" "Yep," I said, smiling. "We'll split custody. You take Ethan. I'll take Lauren." Jake's expression twisted. "That," he started, then stopped. "If you don't agree, there's no deal," I said simply. He clenched his fists. He wanted this divorce finalized so he could run off to his mistress, but now he had to make a choice. Finally, after a long silence, he muttered, "Fine." He thought he was getting off easy, but I knew exactly what kind of mess he had just signed up for. Honestly, I felt no sadness over Ethan staying with Jake. Any maternal affection I had for my son had long faded. Watching my husband's angry outburst earlier, seeing him mirror his father so perfectly, only solidified my decision. I had no confidence in living under the same roof as a boy who had become the spitting image of his father and grandfather. "You went through a rebellious phase too, right?" I said to Jake with a small smile. "Maybe that means you'll understand Ethan better." He didn't argue. We set the final conditions: division of assets, moving expenses, and compensation for dumping all of his father's care on me. It was a hefty sum, but thankfully Jake was still considered an elite earner. He accepted every term without much resistance. "Once we have all of this in a notarized document, I'll file the divorce papers," I said. For the first time in years, I saw relief on his face. After finalizing everything, signing the documents, and receiving my compensation in a lump sum, I officially submitted the divorce paperwork. Just like that, we were no longer husband and wife. "You're free to marry your mistress now," I told him, "or do whatever you want. It's none of my concern." But there was one last thing. "For now, I'm staying here until I find a new place," I reminded him. "That was part of our agreement." Jake's face twisted with irritation. "The sooner you leave, the better. It's unnatural for strangers to keep living in the same house." He didn't say it outright, but I knew exactly what he was thinking. He wanted me gone as soon as possible so he could bring her in. "Oh, right," I said, tilting my head. "I still haven't received the compensation from your mistress." Jake stiffened. "You said you'd think about that after the divorce?" "That's right," I nodded. "And now I'm thinking about it. That wasn't part of the agreement," he snapped. "What agreement?" I said, feigning innocence. "You and I signed our own settlement. Your mistress is a separate issue. The notarized document made no mention of her. I had intentionally left that part out. I won't feel completely settled until I get that compensation too." I added. "You're greedy," Jake muttered under his breath. "The greedy one is her." I shot back. Stealing someone else's husband? That's not free. He had no comeback. Anyway, I continued, crossing my arms. Now that we're strangers, this house isn't yours anymore. Feel free to pack your bags and leave. Jake's face twisted in disbelief. My house? What are you talking about? I ignored his confusion and glanced at my mother-in-law, giving her a small nod. She straightened her back and spoke. This house is mine, she said firmly. Jake blinked. What? This property was never yours, I added, smirking. It belongs to your mother. Jake looked between the two of us, completely lost. I could tell he was struggling to process what he had just heard. That doesn't make sense, he muttered. Dad owned this house. So eventually, it comes to me, right? I let out a small laugh. Your dad? I shook my head. No, Jake. This house was never in your father's name. His brows furrowed. That can't be right. I sighed, deciding to spell it out for him. Your father wasn't the rightful owner of this house. Your mother was, I explained. And since she inherited the property, she's the only one who could decide what happens to it. Jake was still frowning, trying to piece everything together. He never told you, did he? I continued. Your father married into this family. He was an adopted son-in-law. The house, the property, the assets, they were never his to pass down. His whole body seemed to slump as he finally grasped the truth. If the house is Mom's, he muttered, then I'll inherit it eventually anyway. At that, my mother-in-law and I exchanged a knowing look. Not exactly, I said. What does that mean? He demanded. I took a deep breath and delivered the final blow. When we first discussed moving in to care for your father, your mother and I had a long talk, I said, my tone calm and deliberate. That's when we made a decision. Jake looked at his mother, who remained silent. She knew exactly what kind of man your father was, I continued. She also knew about your affair before you ever even moved in. His eyes widened, but he said nothing. At the time, we decided that if you showed remorse, we'd let it go, I said. We would have just moved on. I let the words hang in the air. But you didn't, I added coldly. My mother-in-law finally spoke up. Nikki took care of your father when you wouldn't, she said. This is my way of making things right. Jake clenched his jaw. Making things right? He didn't see it yet. But he would. Because what I had not told him yet was that my mother-in-law had adopted me. Legally. And that meant this house, this entire property, it belonged to me. And Jake was about to learn exactly what that meant for him. You will stay with me forever, my mother-in-law said, looking at me with warmth. I accepted the adoption without hesitation. So, Jake, you're the one who has to leave, I said, turning to my ex-husband. This house isn't yours. You have no right to live here. His mouth hung open in disbelief. What? I've made my decision, my mother-in-law continued. I want to live with Nikki. I have no interest in seeing whoever you marry next. And just so you know, my will states that everything I own will go to her. Mom, how could you do this? Jake stammered. Get out. And take Ethan with you, she said coldly. Jake flinched. You're just going to abandon your own son? He asked, staring at me. I crossed my arms. We agreed to take one child each. You're the one who said you understood Ethan better, remember? People who understand each other should live together. He had no response to that. A few days later, Jake and Ethan packed their things and left the house. I knew exactly where they were headed. A small rental Jake had secured in a hurry. Even though custody went to Jake, Ethan was still my son. But at this point, I couldn't force a relationship. If something happened to him, I would step in, but otherwise, he had made his choice. I'm glad I'm leaving this house, Ethan muttered as he passed me. Living with Dad is going to be so much better. At least he makes real money. Unlike you, stuck working part-time, living in poverty. He had no idea. No idea that his father was about to marry his mistress. No idea about the mountain of debt Jake had accumulated. No idea that the affair had been exposed at work, leading to a pay cut and an impending demotion. Take care, I told him. Let me know if you need anything. I never want to see you again, he shot back. Don't come running to Dad when you're struggling. Women really are so stupid. I watched him walk away, my heart heavy, not with sadness, but with resignation. How would he feel when he finally learned the truth? Would he regret the way he had spoken to me? As a mother, I felt sorry for him, but his personality had twisted into something unrecognizable. His deep-seated hatred for women had been carved into him so completely, I no longer believed I could change him. Jake would have to deal with him now. Once the divorce was finalized, I transitioned from part-time to full-time work. I had always been a pharmacist, choosing the field because I wanted to help people. After giving birth, I had cut my hours to 4 per day, but my job had always been open to me returning full-time. So financially, I was fine. I could send Tara to the school she wanted. I could support whatever future she chose. Ironically, all the renovations Jake had made, thinking of his own future comfort, were now benefiting me instead. Thanks to the updates, the house was comfortable, well-equipped, and perfectly suited for our needs. With my father-in-law gone, my mother-in-law finally had the chance to enjoy life on her own terms. I had never understood what she had seen in such a controlling man, but emotions were complicated. People's feelings didn't always make sense. And as for Tara, she was finally free. Free from Ethan's insults. Free from his constant verbal abuse. She was thriving. One evening, my phone rang. It was Ethan. You must be struggling without a man around, huh? He said smugly. If you want, maybe I'll come back. I nearly laughed. It had nothing to do with me struggling. I knew exactly what was happening in his life. Jake's demotion had finally come through. He and his mistress had been forced to leave the city and move to the countryside. And, unsurprisingly, Ethan's behavior had started causing problems in their home too. Jake's mistress had finally had enough. She was preparing to divorce him, which meant Jake was now desperately trying to push Ethan back onto me. Mom, seriously, do something about Ethan. Jake had whined over the phone a few days earlier. I had politely refused. Now, listening to Ethan's arrogant voice, I simply replied, Thanks for your concern, but we're doing just fine over here. Maybe you should focus on your own life. Then I hung up. Maybe I was being harsh. Maybe a part of me should have felt guilty. But then I remembered the look in his eyes back then, the same look his grandfather used to give me, the same sneer, the same condescending words. I couldn't live with that ever again. Strangely enough, my mother-in-law had never been able to forgive Ethan for acting the same way her husband once had. She had endured her husband's mistreatment for years, but when Ethan picked up the same behaviors, she had finally drawn the line. And so, the three of us, 3 women who had once been trapped in that toxic household, finally had our freedom. Maybe this was our reward for those 2 years of suffering under my father-in-law's care. Looking back, it had only been a few years of my life. A storm that had passed. Now, I could finally focus on the future. A future of calm, of comfort, of peace. And I intended to enjoy every moment of it.